Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content explores the legal history and social evolution of divorce law and family dynamics in the United States. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Laws regarding domestic relations vary significantly by state and have changed drastically since the 1980s. Therefore, viewers should conduct their own due diligence and consult with a qualified professional regarding their specific circumstances. Imagine a world where you are trapped in a contract you never signed, under terms that no longer apply, with a person you no longer recognize, and the government tells you that you cannot leave. For decades in America, that wasn't a dystopian fiction. It was the reality of marriage. But as the clock struck midnight on December 31, 1979, a powder keg was waiting to explode. By the mid-1980s, the United States didn't just see an increase in divorce. It witnessed a total cultural insurrection against the nuclear family structure, as it had been known for a century. In 1981 alone, the divorce rate hit a historic peak of 5.3 per 1,000 people, a number so staggering it sent shockwaves through the Census Bureau and the hallowed halls of Congress. We aren't just talking about people falling out of love. We are talking about the Divorce Now movement, a chaotic, litigious, and deeply personal era, where the pursuit of individual happiness collided head-on with the traditional bedrock of American society. Today we are pulling back the curtain on the decade that broke the American home, exploring why it happened, who it benefited, and why the Divorce Now mantra of the 1980s is still the primary reason your modern relationships look the way they do. If you have ever wondered why no fault is the standard or why the 50% divorce rate statistic is burned into your brain, you are about to see the raw, unedited blueprint of how we got here. The problem this deep dive solves for you today is one of historical perspective and modern navigation. Many of us living in the 2020s view the high rate of marital dissolution as a new or failing trend, but in reality, we are simply living in the aftershocks of the 1980s earthquake. By understanding the Divorce Now movement, you will gain the ability to decode the current legal landscape of asset division, the psychological shift toward expressive individualism, and the economic realities that force millions of American women to choose between a paycheck and a wedding ring. We are moving past the surface-level nostalgia of the 80s and looking at the cold, hard data of a nation in transition. To understand the 1980s, we have to look at the immediate precursor, the legislative shift of the 1970s. Before this era, if you wanted a divorce, you had to prove fault. This meant one spouse had to legally humiliate the other in an adversarial court proceeding, proving adultery, extreme cruelty, or willful desertion. This created a divorce mill culture where people would travel to states like Nevada just to find a more lenient judge. However, by the time Ronald Reagan, the only divorced president in U.S. history at that point, took office, the no-fault revolution had swept across nearly every state. California had led the charge in 1969, but it took until the mid-1980s for the cultural impact to fully ripen. The Divorce Now movement was fueled by this new legal ease. Suddenly, the state was no longer interested in why you were leaving. They were only interested in how you were splitting the station wagon and the suburban ranch house. This legal shift coincided with a massive economic transformation. In the 1980s, the two-income household moved from a luxury or a temporary necessity to a baseline requirement for middle-class survival. As women entered the workforce in record numbers, reaching nearly 52% by 1981, the power dynamic within the home shifted. Financial independence meant that for the first time in American history, a woman didn't need a husband's signature to get a credit card or a mortgage, a right only solidified by the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, but only fully realized in the consumer-driven 80s. The Divorce Now movement was, in many ways, an economic emancipation. When a spouse is no longer financially tethered to a partner, the cost of leaving drops, and the value of personal peace rises. We see this in the case studies of the era. Look at the rise of the silver splitters during this time, couples who had stayed together for decades under the old rules, but used the newfound economic flexibility of the 1980s to finally separate. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the self. The 1970s were famously called the Me Decade by Tom Wolfe, but the 1980s took that seed and grew a forest of self-actualization. Pop culture became obsessed with the idea that staying in a dead marriage was a form of psychological suicide. Best-selling books of the time didn't talk about working through it. They talked about finding yourself. The Divorce Now movement was bolstered by a media landscape that reframed divorce not as a failure, but as a creative transition. Think about the cinematic impact of films like Kramer vs. Kramer, which, although released in late 1979, defined the domestic discourse of the early 80s. It showcased the brutal reality of custody battles and the shifting roles of fathers, moving away from the provider archetype toward a more involved, albeit legally embattled, parent. Step by step, the movement dismantled the stigma. In the early 1980s, the church's influence on the American family began to meet the immovable object of televised secularism. Daytime talk shows like Donahue and later The Oprah Winfrey Show provided a national forum for disgruntled spouses to voice their grievances. This created a feedback loop. The more people talked about divorce on television, the more normal it became in the cul-de-sacs of Ohio and the apartments of New York. The psychological barrier, the shame factor, was being systematically eradicated. By 1985, the phrase conscious uncoupling might not have been in the lexicon, but the sentiment was everywhere. People were being told by therapists and talk show hosts alike that their primary responsibility was to their own mental health, even if that meant breaking the family unit. Furthermore, the 1980s introduced the concept of the split-level divorce. This refers to the widening gap between how different socioeconomic classes experience the divorce now movement. For the wealthy, the 1980s brought about the era of the high-stakes divorce, where the division of corporate stocks, pension plans, and complex real estate portfolios became a niche industry for specialized lawyers. For the working class, however, the movement often led to what sociologists called the feminization of poverty. As the divorce rate surged, the number of single-mother households skyrocketed, and the legal system struggled to keep up with child support enforcement. This led to the passage of the Child Support Enforcement Amendments of 1984, a federal attempt to rein in the chaos that the Divorce Now movement had inadvertently caused. This wasn't just a social trend. It was a legislative nightmare that required the government to step into the role of the missing father on a scale never seen before. As we move deeper into this 10-part masterclass, we will examine the specific marketing of divorce in the 80s, the rise of the divorce party, and the profound way this decade changed the architecture of the American home literally. We will look at how the housing market adapted to a nation of single parents and how the toy industry, the education system, and even the fast food industry pivoted to serve the needs of the latchkey kid generation. The 1980s didn't just change the way we loved. It changed the way we lived, worked, and perceived the very idea of a forever commitment. This was the decade of the Great Breakup, and the pieces are still being picked up today. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Divorce Now movement, you have to look at the explosive commercialization of marital dissolution that occurred between 1982 and 1986. This was the era where the legal profession transformed from a quiet, conservative brotherhood into a high-octane marketing machine. Before the 1980s, lawyers in many states faced heavy restrictions on advertising their services. However, following the ripple effects of the 1977 Supreme Court case Bates v. State Bar of Arizona, the floodgates opened just as the divorce rate was peaking. By 1983, the American public was being bombarded with late-night television commercials and full-page yellow page ads that framed divorce not as a tragedy, but as a consumer right. Imagine being a husband or wife in 1984, sitting in a living room in suburban Ohio. You are frustrated with your spouse and suddenly, a commercial flashes on your wood-paneled Zenith television screen. A sleek, confident attorney looks into the camera and tells you that you deserve a fresh start. They offer a flat-rate uncontested divorce for $300. This was the commodification of the American family. Case studies from this era show a distinct shift in how people approach the legal system. Take the hypothetical but highly representative case of Robert, a mid-level manager at a growing tech firm in 1985. Under the old laws of the late 60s, Robert would have had to prove his wife had committed a specific legal sin to leave. In the Divorce Now era, Robert simply walked into a strip mall law office that specialized in high-volume filings. These offices were the McDonald's of the legal world. They used standardized forms, paralegal assembly lines, and aggressive billing cycles to process thousands of divorces a month. The movement wasn't just driven by ideology. It was driven by a new sector of the economy that realized there was more money to be made in breaking families apart than in keeping them together. This led to the professionalization of the divorce industry, including the rise of forensic accountants and child psychologists who became permanent fixtures in the courtroom. The economic data of the mid-80s reveals a startling trend often called the divergence of the domestic dollar. When the Divorce Now movement hit its stride, it created a massive wealth transfer. For the first time, Courts began to view a professional degree or a career's potential earnings as a marital asset. This was the era of the O'Brien v. O'Brien case in New York, where the court ruled that a husband's medical license was marital property subject to equitable distribution. This changed the stakes forever. It wasn't just about who got the house or the dog. It was about who owned the future earnings of the individual. This legal precedent sent a clear message to every ambitious professional in America. Your career is no longer just yours. It is a shared commodity of the marriage contract. This realization paradoxically accelerated the movement, as spouses rushed to file before their partners' careers became even more valuable, or before new laws could complicate the exit strategy. Historical trends during this period show that the movement was heavily influenced by the transition from an industrial economy to a service and information economy. In an industrial world, the family was a unit of production. In the 1980s information age, the individual became the primary unit of consumption. Corporations realized that two single-person households buy 2 washing machines, 2 televisions, and 2 sets of furniture, whereas a married couple only buys 1. While it is a cynical view, the Divorce Now movement aligned perfectly with the hyper-consumerism of the Reagan era. The cultural push for self-care and living your best life was mirrored by a market that was ready to supply the goods for your new post-divorce lifestyle. We see this in the real estate shifts of 1986. Developers began building smaller, high-density condos in cities like Atlanta and Dallas specifically to cater to the newly divorced demographic who no longer needed or wanted the maintenance of a 4-bedroom suburban home. Imagine if you were a child in 1987, part of the first massive wave of the latchkey generation. Your reality was defined by the Divorce Now movement. The societal impact was so profound that even the school system had to be restructured. Schools began staying open later, and the after-school special became a staple of television, specifically designed to help children navigate the complex emotions of their parents' split. This wasn't just a change in the law. It was a fundamental rewiring of the American childhood. The movement created a new vocabulary for kids: weekend dad, joint custody, and visitation rights. These weren't legal terms to these children. They were the boundaries of their daily existence. The movement also faced a fierce, but ultimately losing, counterinsurgency from traditionalist groups. By 1988, there was a visible pro-family backlash. Organizations tried to push for a return to fault-based divorce or covenant marriages that would make it harder to leave. They pointed to the rising poverty levels among single mothers and the psychological data regarding children of divorce. However, the momentum of the Divorce Now era was too strong. The genie of individual autonomy was out of the bottle. Americans had tasted the freedom to exit an unhappy situation without the state's permission, and they were not going back. The movement was no longer just about legal papers, it was about the American identity itself. We had become a nation that prioritized the pursuit of happiness over the endurance of obligation. The complexity of this era is best seen in the evolution of the prenuptial agreement. In the early 80s, a prenup was something reserved for Hollywood stars or the ultra-wealthy. By the end of the decade, it was becoming a standard tool for the upper middle class. The Divorce Now movement had taught a brutal lesson. Every marriage has a potential expiration date. People started entering marriages with an exit plan already in mind. This changed the very nature of the romantic proposal. It went from a leap of faith to a negotiated settlement. This era solidified the idea that marriage was a partnership of limited liability, rather than a merger of souls. As we look at the year 2026, we see the children of the Divorce Now movement, the Gen Zers and early millennials, approaching their own relationships with a level of caution and skepticism that was forged in the fires of the 1980s. The movement didn't just end with a final decree in a courtroom. It lived on in the way subsequent generations approached cohabitation, child-rearing, and the very concept of the one. The 1980s gave us the tools to leave, but it didn't necessarily give us a map for where to go next. But what happened when the legal battles moved from the courtroom into the corporate boardroom? What occurred when the biggest brands in the world realized that the divorced consumer was the most profitable demographic in history? And most importantly, what was the secret clause that many lawyers used in the mid-80s to trap unsuspecting spouses in a cycle of litigation that lasted decades? In the next part, we are going to expose the dark underbelly of the divorce industrial complex and the specific case that nearly bankrupted one of the most famous families in America, changing the way assets are hidden forever. You think you know how a divorce works, but you haven't seen the 1980s playbook for total financial warfare. The 1980s did not just simplify the process of leaving. It weaponized the process of splitting. As the Divorce Now movement gained momentum, a new and aggressive playbook for financial warfare emerged, transforming the American courtroom into a battlefield of scorched earth tactics. This was the era of the discovery phase becoming a hunt for blood. To understand how deep this went, we have to look at the rise of the forensic accountant as a household name. Before this decade, most people simply split what was in the bank account. By 1987, high-net-worth individuals were engaging in complex games of hide-and-seek with marital assets that would make a modern tax haven look like a piggy bank. Imagine the case of a corporate executive named Stephen in 1988 Chicago. Stephen had spent the better part of the decade climbing the ladder of a Fortune 500 company. When the Divorce Now wave hit his household, Stephen didn't just walk away. He utilized the prevailing legal climate to engage in what was known as asset shielding. He moved bonuses into offshore accounts, deferred his executive compensation packages, and buried stock options in shell companies that were technically owned by distant relatives. This was the dark side of the 1980s financial boom. As the economy grew, so did the sophistication of people trying to keep their partners from getting a piece of that growth. The Divorce Now movement created a demand for specialized financial hitmen, lawyers and accountants whose sole job was to ensure that equitable distribution was anything but equitable. Historical trends show that this financial aggression led to the creation of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, which became a standard tool of the 1980s legal system. This allowed courts to divide retirement plans, which were often the largest single asset outside of the family home. Step by step, the legal system had to evolve to catch up with the cunning of the era. First, the courts established that pensions were marital property. Second, they created the mechanism to move those funds without triggering immediate tax penalties. Third, they empowered the non-working spouse to claim a portion of the future. This was a direct response to the movement's push for total autonomy. You couldn't have true independence if you were 60 years old with no access to the retirement funds you helped build through decades of domestic support. This era also birthed the concept of the lifestyle analysis. Imagine if a court-appointed investigator spent 3 months looking at every single grocery receipt, every vacation booking, and every dry cleaning bill you had paid over the last 5 years. In the mid-80s, this became common practice in what were called high-conflict divorces. The goal was to establish the marital standard of living. If a husband claimed he was broke but was still wearing $5,000 suits and driving a Porsche, the lifestyle analysis would expose the lie. Case studies from 1986 show that these investigations often uncovered massive amounts of unreported income, leading to a secondary wave of IRS audits. The Divorce Now movement didn't just end marriages. It frequently ended professional reputations and started criminal investigations. The psychological warfare was just as intense. As the movement matured, we saw the introduction of parental alienation as a strategic, albeit devastating legal maneuver. Lawyers in the mid-80s began to realize that the person who controlled the narrative of the children often controlled the house and the largest share of the assets. This led to a decade where children were frequently coached on what to say to social workers and judges. Imagine if you were 10 years old in 1989, and your father sat you down to explain that your mother was leaving not because she wanted a new life, but because she didn't love you anymore. This wasn't just a personal failing. It was a tactical move designed to win custody and, by extension, the child support checks that came with it. The Divorce Now movement also coincided with the rise of the predatory private investigator. By 1985, the PI industry in the United States had pivoted almost entirely toward domestic surveillance. Even in no-fault states, finding evidence of a partner's bad behavior was used as leverage in settlement negotiations. If you could prove your spouse was spending marital funds on a lover or a drug habit, you could argue for a larger share of the remaining assets under the theory of dissipation of marital funds. This created a culture of paranoia. People were checking their car bumpers for tracking devices and tapping their own home phones. The suburban dream was being monitored by high-speed cameras and long-range microphones. We must also look at the role of the 1986 Tax Reform Act in the Divorce Now movement. This major piece of legislation changed how alimony was taxed, making it less of a tax break for the payer and more of a burden. This sparked a massive rush to finalize divorces before the new tax year began. In December 1986, courthouses across the United States were jammed with couples trying to beat the clock. It was a literal fire sale on marriages. The government was inadvertently incentivizing the great breakup by changing the math of the exit. This proves that the movement was never just about emotions. It was a series of cold, calculated financial decisions driven by shifts in federal law. The case of the famous family mentioned earlier, the prominent New York real estate dynasty, highlights how these tactics were perfected. During their 1988 split, the legal teams didn't just argue about the value of buildings, they argued about the value of the brand name itself. They debated whether the social status of being married to a billionaire was a tangible asset that could be appraised and divided. This case set the precedent for celebrity divorces for the next 40 years. It taught the American public that everything, your reputation, your social circle, even your future potential as a public figure, was on the table for negotiation. By the time 1989 arrived, the Divorce Now movement had created a new class of professional, the divorce consultant. These were people who weren't necessarily lawyers but were experts in the logistics of starting over. They advised on everything from how to open a secret bank account to how to move your belongings out of a house in under 2 hours while your spouse was at work. This was the Get Out manual of the 80s. It was a time of extreme efficiency and extreme coldness. The movement had successfully rebranded the end of a family as a business liquidation. But as the decade closed, a new and unexpected consequence began to emerge. The very people who had fought for the right to leave were now finding themselves in a lonely, hyper-competitive world where the safety net of the nuclear family was gone. This leads us to the most controversial aspect of the entire movement: the rise of the disposable dad, and the legal crisis that would eventually lead to the Million Man March of the 90s. But what happened when the children of these 1980s divorces grew up and decided they wanted revenge? What was the grandchild clause that started appearing in wills by 1989 to prevent ex-spouses from ever touching the family inheritance? And why did a specific 1980s fashion trend actually help lawyers catch cheating spouses in the act? In the next part, we are going deeper into the surveillance tech of the 80s and the shocking way the Divorce Now movement actually fueled the rise of the modern internet. You think social media started in the 2000s, but the digital footprints of the Great Breakup began much earlier than you think. The transition from paper trails to digital footprints began in the mid-1980s, as a direct byproduct of the Divorce Now movement's need for information. Before the World Wide Web became a household utility, the legal community was already building what would become the precursor to modern data mining. As marital dissolution became more complex, lawyers and private investigators realized they needed a way to track assets and behavioral patterns across state lines more efficiently. This led to the widespread adoption of early database services like LexisNexis by matrimonial firms. They were no longer just looking through dusty ledgers in a basement. They were using early computer terminals to find out if a spouse had purchased property in a different jurisdiction under a different name. This was the first time in history that an individual's personal financial life was being converted into a searchable digital format for the express purpose of litigation. Imagine if it is 1986 and you are a wife named Sarah in Los Angeles. You suspect your husband, an international consultant, has been diverting funds into accounts you cannot see. In the 1970s, you would have been at a dead end. But in the mid-80s, Sarah's legal team employed a digital forensic pioneer, a person who specialized in searching the burgeoning electronic networks of banks and credit bureaus. These early hackers of the legal world were essentially building the first social graphs. By cross-referencing credit card applications, airline frequent flyer numbers, which were a relatively new phenomenon in the 80s, and hotel reservation systems, they could reconstruct a person's life with terrifying accuracy. This demand for interconnected data to win divorce cases provided a massive financial incentive for the tech sector to speed up the digitization of public records. The Divorce Now movement effectively funded the beta test for the surveillance state we live in today in 2026. Historical trends during this period also show a massive spike in the sales of consumer electronics specifically marketed for home security and surveillance. The 1980s was the decade of the camcorder. While these devices were marketed for filming birthday parties and graduations, they were frequently used as tools for domestic espionage. We see case studies where spouses would hide early, bulky video cameras in bookshelves, or use voice-activated tape recorders tucked under car seats. This created a boom in the private security industry. By 1987, companies were springing up that specialized in sweeping homes for bugs and hidden cameras. The home, once considered a sanctuary, had become a high-tech monitoring zone. This cultural shift normalized the idea that your most private conversations could and would be used against you in a court of law. It fundamentally altered how Americans communicated within their own families. A cautious, guarded tone began to replace the openness of previous generations. This era of surveillance also tapped into a specific 1980s fashion trend: the rise of the luxury designer label. You might wonder how a Versace suit or a Rolex watch could help a lawyer catch a cheating spouse. But in the 80s, brand name consumerism was a loud, visible indicator of hidden wealth. In high-conflict divorces, private investigators would wait outside high-end boutiques on Rodeo Drive or Fifth Avenue. If a spouse who claimed to be living on a meager salary was seen carrying bags from Tiffany or wearing a new Piaget watch, that photographic evidence was used to initiate a more aggressive discovery process. The conspicuous consumption of the 80s became the conspicuous evidence of the courtroom. Lawyers would even subpoena the records of exclusive country clubs and high-end clothiers to prove that a spouse's reported income didn't match their actual lifestyle. The movement turned every purchase into a potential piece of evidence. The Divorce Now movement's impact on the internet also manifested in the very first online communities. In the late 80s, bulletin board systems or BBS were the frontier of the digital world. Many of the most active boards were dedicated to divorce support and legal strategies. Men and women would dial in via slow modems to share tips on everything from finding the most aggressive local attorneys to how to cope with the isolation of being a single parent in a society that still largely prioritized the nuclear family. These were the first digital support groups. They allowed people to bypass the geographical limitations of their social circles. If you were the only person getting a divorce in a small town in Kansas, you could now connect with thousands of others in the same situation across the country. This accelerated the movement by creating a sense of collective identity. People no longer felt like individual failures, they felt like members of a massive social revolution. Furthermore, we must look at how the 1980s redefined the architecture of the American office to accommodate the new reality of the divorced worker. As the movement took hold, corporations realized that a significant portion of their workforce was undergoing extreme personal stress. This led to the birth of the Employee Assistance Program, or EAP. Originally designed to deal with alcoholism in the 70s, EAPs in the 80s shifted their focus to domestic crisis management. Companies began offering legal referrals and counseling as part of their benefit packages. This wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. It was a cold calculation to maintain productivity. A worker distracted by a custody battle is a worker who isn't making the company money. The Divorce Now movement forced the corporate world to acknowledge that the private life of an employee was a direct variable in the bottom line. Step by step, the movement also changed the way the insurance industry operated. In 1985 and 1986, insurance companies had to completely rewrite their policies regarding health and life coverage for fractured families. This led to the COBRA legislation of 1985, which allowed divorced spouses to maintain health insurance coverage for a limited time after a split. Before this, a non-working spouse could literally lose their access to medical care the moment a divorce decree was signed. The Divorce Now movement was so powerful that it forced the federal government to create a safety net for the casualties of the Great Breakup. It was a massive expansion of the state's role in the personal lives of its citizens, all triggered by the rising rate of marital failure. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the 1980s playbook was the use of the grandchild clause. As the decade ended, wealthy grandparents who were watching their children's marriages dissolve in expensive, public battles began to take preventative measures. They started rewriting their wills to ensure that if their children divorced, the family inheritance would skip the spouse and even the child, going directly into ironclad trusts for the grandchildren. This was a move to protect the family legacy from the Divorce Now movement's equitable distribution laws. It turned family gatherings into sessions of legal maneuvering and created a new layer of resentment and suspicion that would last for generations. As we look at the historical data, the 1980s stands out as the moment when the American family stopped being a cohesive unit and started being a collection of individuals with competing legal interests. The Divorce Now movement didn't just make it easier to leave. It made it a strategic necessity for many to protect their own futures at the expense of their partners. But what happened when these strategies moved into the realm of the middle class, where there wasn't enough money to go around? What was the custody trap that many fathers fell into in 1988, which led to a complete restructuring of child support laws? And why did a specific 1980s toy commercial become a key piece of evidence in one of the most famous custody battles of the century? In the next part, we are going to look at the war for the kids and the rise of the psychological profile as a weapon in the 1980s courtroom. You won't believe how far parents were willing to go to win. By 1988, the Divorce Now movement had entered its most aggressive phase, shifting the focus from the pocketbook to the playroom. This was the era where the psychological profile became the ultimate weapon in the American courtroom. If you were going through a divorce in 1989, it wasn't enough to show you had a stable job and a clean house. You had to prove your spouse was psychologically unfit to be a parent. This led to the rise of the court-appointed custody evaluator, a professional whose entire job was to dissect the personality of each parent through a battery of tests, like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Imagine a mother named Linda in Miami. She is sitting in a sterile office, answering hundreds of true or false questions designed to detect everything from depression to latent hostility. Her results would be compiled into a report that could permanently decide how many days a month she would see her children. The psychological profile was the nuclear option, and in the late 80s, everyone was reaching for the button. Case studies from this era reveal the birth of the custody trap. Historical trends show that as more fathers began to fight for joint or primary custody, a shift from the 1970s tender years doctrine, which almost always favored mothers, the courtroom became a theater of character assassination. To win, lawyers advised clients to keep a litigation diary. Every time a spouse was 5 minutes late for a pickup, every time they forgot to pack a lunch, and every time they raised their voice, it was recorded as evidence of parental incompetence. This created a generation of parents who were terrified to make a mistake, knowing that a single lapse in judgment would be presented to a judge as a pattern of neglect. The war for the kids wasn't fought with logic, it was fought with the accumulation of petty grievances transformed into legal testimony. Consider the role of the 1980s toy industry in this psychological warfare. In a bizarre but real-world example from 1988, a high-stakes custody battle in New York actually pivoted on a television commercial for a popular action figure. The father's legal team argued that the mother was culturally negligent because she refused to let the son play with the toys his father bought him, claiming she was alienating the child from his father's interests. They used the commercial to show the judge exactly what the child was missing out on, framing the mother as an obstacle to the child's social development. This sounds absurd in 2026, but in the heat of the Divorce Now movement, every lifestyle choice was a potential legal liability. If you were too traditional, you were stifling the child. If you were too progressive, you were unstable. There was no middle ground in the quest for total victory. Step by step, the legal system responded to this chaos by introducing the concept of the guardian ad litem. This was a lawyer specifically appointed to represent the interests of the child, independent of the parents. While this sounds like a positive development in the mid to late 80s, it often added another layer of litigation. Parents now had to campaign to the guardian ad litem, treating them like a political constituent. They would decorate the children's bedrooms with extravagant toys and schedule elaborate, memory-making outings just to impress the observer. This was the era of the Disney dad and the overcompensated mom. The movement had forced parents to turn their homes into stage sets where they performed the role of the perfect caregiver for an audience of one. The psychological toll on the children was immense and led to a landmark shift in how the American public viewed the impact of the Divorce Now era. In 1989, a major longitudinal study began to gain national traction, suggesting that the resilient child narrative of the early 80s was a myth. The data started to show that children of high-conflict divorces were experiencing long-term academic and social challenges. This created a secondary guilt movement. Parents who had been told that the kids will be fine as long as you are happy were suddenly faced with headlines telling them they were causing permanent damage. This tension defines the end of the decade, the collision between the right to individual happiness and the duty of parental sacrifice. Imagine if you were a child in 1988, and your parents were caught in the joint custody loop. The 1980s saw the rise of the two-home child, where kids would spend Monday through Wednesday with one parent and Thursday through Sunday with the other. To the courts, this looked like equality. To the child, it was a logistical nightmare. They lived out of suitcases, often with two different sets of rules and two different sets of friends. Historical trends show that this 50-50 split was often pushed by fathers' rights groups who were fighting against the high child support payments that usually accompanied sole custody arrangements. The Divorce Now movement had turned the child into a pawn in a financial negotiation. If a parent could get more time, they paid less money. This was the cold, hard math of the 1980s domestic experience. Furthermore, the 1980s saw the introduction of the supervised visitation industry. For parents deemed at risk by a psychological profile, a new business model emerged. Facilities where you could pay an hourly rate to play with your child while a social worker took notes from the corner of the room. This was the ultimate humiliation for many parents, and it became a common feature of the Divorce Now landscape. It professionalized the breakdown of the parent-child bond, turning what should have been a private relationship into a regulated, commercial transaction. The movement had successfully replaced the extended family with a network of paid professionals. By 1989, the Divorce Now movement had also influenced the way corporate America handled family benefits. Companies began offering dependent care flexible spending accounts and expanding parental leave, not necessarily to support traditional families, but to accommodate the chaotic schedules of their divorced employees. Corporations realized that if they didn't help their employees manage their custody schedules, they would lose their best talent to the stress of litigation. This was the moment the family-friendly workplace was born, ironically fueled by the destruction of the family unit. But as the war for the kids reached its peak, a new and darker trend began to emerge in the legal documents of the late 80s. It was called the relocation restriction. As parents began to move for new jobs in the booming 1980s economy, the court started issuing orders that prevented a parent from moving more than 50 miles away from their ex-spouse without a grueling court battle. This turned entire cities into geographic prisons for divorced parents. You could be free from your spouse, but you were legally tethered to the zip code where they lived for the next 18 years. What happened when a parent decided to break the relocation restriction and vanish into the American heartland? How did the 1980s technological boom lead to the creation of the first national database of missing parents? And what was the secret tape recorded in 1989 that finally convinced the U.S. government that child support collection needed to be handled by the same people who collect your taxes? In the next part, we are going to dive into the hunt for the underground parent and the birth of the modern enforcement state. You think the IRS is scary? Wait until you see how they handled deadbeat parents in the late 80s. The stakes were about to get much higher, and the hunters were being given more power than ever before. The shift from civil litigation to federal enforcement began in earnest as the 1980s drew to a close. By 1988, the American government realized that the Divorce Now movement had created a massive fiscal leak. Millions of single-mother households were slipping below the poverty line, not because of a lack of work ethic, but because the court-ordered support systems were failing. This ushered in the era of the Child Support Enforcement Amendments and the subsequent Family Support Act of 1988. This wasn't just another set of rules. It was the birth of a surveillance apparatus designed to track the financial movement of every divorced parent in the country. Before this, child support was largely handled by local counties with archaic filing systems. If a parent moved 2 states over, they effectively vanished. But the late 80s saw the federal government step in with the power of the Internal Revenue Service and the Social Security Administration. Imagine a man named David in 1989. David had left his family in New Jersey and moved to Arizona to start a new life. In 1975, David would have been a ghost. But in 1989, for the first time, his Social Security number became a digital tether. The moment David took a job in Phoenix and his employer filed a W-4 form, a flag was raised in a centralized database. Under the new 1988 laws, states were now required to use automated tracking systems. David's wages were garnished before he even saw his first paycheck. This was a radical departure from American norms of financial privacy. The government had decided that the debt owed to a child superseded the privacy rights of the individual. This created a new social class in the late 80s, the underground parent. These were individuals who worked for cash, lived under aliases, or constantly hopped between low-wage jobs to stay one step ahead of the automated garnishment systems. Historical trends show that this enforcement boom led to a massive increase in the power of the state. By 1989, states began to implement the revocation of professional and driver's licenses as a penalty for non-payment. Imagine being a long-haul trucker or a licensed plumber whose entire livelihood depends on those credentials. Suddenly, a domestic dispute from 3 years ago could result in the state taking away your ability to work. Case studies from this period illustrate the desperation this caused. It created a cycle where the very people who needed to earn money to pay support were legally barred from doing so. This irony was a hallmark of the late 80s enforcement surge. The Divorce Now movement had promised a clean break, but for millions of men, it resulted in a lifetime of state-monitored labor. This era also saw the rise of the private collection agency for domestic debt. Companies began to emerge that specialized in hunting parents for a percentage of the recovered funds. They used the same aggressive tactics as credit card debt collectors, but with the added moral weight of doing it for the children. They would call neighbors, show up at workplaces, and use early public records databases to find hidden assets. This was the commercialization of the enforcement state. The 1980s had turned divorce into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the collection phase was the final, most profitable frontier. It was no longer a private family matter. It was a line item on a corporate balance sheet. Step by step, the technology of the 1980s fueled this hunt. The introduction of the first portable cellular phones and the expansion of credit reporting agencies meant that skipping town became nearly impossible. If you used a credit card to buy gas in 1989, you were leaving a breadcrumb trail for the state. We saw the beginning of the most wanted posters in local post offices, but instead of bank robbers, they featured fathers who owed back child support. This public shaming was a powerful tool in the late 80s. It was designed to make the social cost of leaving as high as the financial cost. The Divorce Now movement's ideal of the seamless transition was being replaced by a reality of public stigma and permanent debt. Consider the role of the 1989 wage withholding mandates. This was the moment child support went from something you paid to something that was taken. By making wage withholding the default for all new divorce cases, the government removed the agency of the payer. This had a profound psychological impact on the American male identity. For many, it felt like a return to a form of indentured servitude, where the fruits of their labor were redirected by the state before they could even provide for their own new households. This led to the rise of the first organized men's rights groups of the late 80s, who argued that the system was being used to subsidize the lifestyles of ex-spouses rather than just the needs of the children. These groups utilized the burgeoning talk radio circuit of 1989 to voice their dissent, creating a cultural friction that would define the gender politics of the next decade. The economic data from the end of the decade is clear. The Divorce Now movement had created a massive wealth gap between single-mother households and single-father households. Despite the aggressive enforcement, the average standard of living for women dropped by an estimated 27% in the first year after a 1980s divorce, while men often saw a modest increase in their disposable income. This disparity is what drove the government to become even more aggressive. We saw the introduction of the Intercept program, where tax refunds were automatically seized to pay off domestic debts. Imagine a person in 1989 counting on their tax return to fix their car or pay a medical bill, only to receive a letter stating that the funds had been diverted to a case from 5 years ago. This was the beginning of a zero-sum game played with the lives of the American working class. Furthermore, the late 80s saw the professionalization of the expert witness in child support hearings. Economic consultants were hired to project the future costs of a child's life, including things like private school tuition, extracurricular activities, and future college inflation. These projections were often based on the hyperinflationary trends of the 80s, leading to support orders that were virtually impossible for a middle-class parent to maintain long-term. This was the economic trap. If you had a good year in 1988 and got a bonus, your support order might be adjusted upward, but if you lost your job in the 1990 recession, it was notoriously difficult to get that order adjusted downward. The movement had created a legal system that was quick to increase obligations, but incredibly slow to recognize economic reality. As we look back from 2026, we see that this enforcement era laid the groundwork for the modern administrative state. The tools developed to catch deadbeat dads in 1989, the database sharing, the license revocations, the wage garnishments, are the same tools used today for a wide variety of state interests. The Divorce Now movement was the Trojan horse that allowed the government into the most intimate corners of the American paycheck. It wasn't just about families splitting up. It was about the state becoming the permanent mediator and collector of the domestic contract. But what happened when the hunted parents started fighting back with a new legal theory? What occurred when a group of mothers in 1989 discovered that the government was actually skimming money off the top of their child support payments to cover administrative costs? And why did a specific episode of a popular 1980s sitcom lead to a nationwide protest against the way divorce was being portrayed in the media? In the next part, we are going to look at the media backlash and the secret meetings in Hollywood that changed the way your favorite television families were written. You think The Cosby Show and Roseanne were just entertainment? They were actually frontline propaganda in the war over the American family. In Part 7, we expose the scripts behind the scripts. By 1989, the Divorce Now movement had collided with the most powerful force in American culture, the television sitcom. For decades, the small screen had been the primary architect of the American domestic ideal. But as the divorce rate hovered near its historic high, Hollywood found itself in a crisis of representation. Network executives realized that the traditional nuclear family of the 1950s was no longer a relatable reality for the millions of viewers living in fractured households. This led to a period of intense, behind-the-scenes negotiation between social scientists, government lobbyists, and television writers. They weren't just making art. They were engaging in a massive sociological experiment to see if television could stabilize a nation that was legally and emotionally pulling itself apart. Imagine you are a head writer for a major network in 1988. Your instructions are clear. You must acknowledge the Divorce Now movement, but you must do so in a way that provides a blueprint for social order. This was the birth of the instructional sitcom. Take a show like The Cosby Show, which reigned supreme in the mid-80s. While it portrayed a stable upper-middle-class nuclear family, its scripts were often meticulously crafted to model correct parenting in an era of chaos. Historical trends show that the show functioned as a counter-narrative to the Divorce Now movement, a visual anchor for a public that felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Every episode was a case study in conflict resolution, designed to show that the family unit could still be the ultimate source of authority and comfort, even as the real-world data suggested otherwise. On the other end of the spectrum, you had the gritty realism of Roseanne. Launched in 1988, it spoke directly to the working-class families who were most affected by the economic fallout of the 1980s divorce surge. Imagine if you were a parent in 1989 struggling with wage garnishments or the cost of childcare. Roseanne didn't offer a polished fantasy. It offered a mirror. However, the media backlash occurred when viewers realized that even these realistic shows were being used to push specific social agendas. In 1989, a specific plotline involving a secondary character's divorce led to a nationwide outcry. The character was portrayed as finding immediate, blissful freedom, which many critics argued was irresponsible propaganda that ignored the feminization of poverty and the psychological trauma of the children involved. This was the moment the public began to suspect that the Divorce Now mantra was being sold to them by people who didn't have to live with the consequences. Step by step, the media industry began to implement what became known as the second chance narrative. Hollywood started flooding the market with stories of blended families. Shows like Full House and My Two Dads were not just random creative choices. They were responses to a market that needed to see that life continued after the Divorce Now movement. These shows normalized the idea of non-traditional households, but they often did so by erasing the presence of the problematic ex-spouse. The movement had made the exit easy, and the media made the aftermath look like a whimsical adventure. This created a profound disconnect between the televised experience and the lived experience of millions of American children who were dealing with the custody trap we discussed earlier. Consider the role of the 1980s talk show as a weapon of the Divorce Now era. Shows like Geraldo and Sally Jessy Raphael became the public squares of the movement. They didn't just discuss divorce, they staged it. Imagine a husband and wife in 1989 being flown to New York to air their grievances in front of a live audience. This was the precursor to the modern reality obsession. These shows functioned as a form of social engineering, teaching viewers exactly what language to use in their own legal battles. They popularized terms like irreconcilable differences and personal growth, turning legal jargon into everyday speech. This cultural saturation made the Divorce Now decision feel inevitable for many, as it was the only solution being modeled on every channel, 24 hours a day. Data from 1989 suggests that this media blitz actually had a measurable impact on filing rates. Whenever a major television character went through a high-profile split, local law offices reported a spike in inquiries. This is what sociologists call social contagion. The Divorce Now movement was being amplified by the very screens in our living rooms. However, a secret meeting took place in Los Angeles in late 1989 among the big three networks. The agenda was simple. The Divorce Now movement was becoming bad for business. Advertisers, particularly those in the automotive and household goods sectors, were concerned that the fragmentation of the family was leading to more erratic consumer behavior. They wanted a return to traditional values messaging, not out of morality, but for market stability. This led to the correction of 1990, where television scripts suddenly began to emphasize reconciliation over relocation. We saw characters who were on the brink of divorce deciding to stay together for the sake of the kids or the community. This was the industry's attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, but the public wasn't buying it. A case study from 1989 involves a mid-tier sitcom that tried to undo a divorce plotline by having the couple remarry in the season finale. The ratings plummeted. The American public had been told for a decade that they deserved to be happy, and that leaving was an act of courage. They weren't going to be told to go back to the way things were by a 22-minute script. The Divorce Now movement had successfully changed the American narrative arc. In the 1950s, the story ended with, "I do." In the 1980s, the story began with, "I'm done." This shift was so deep that it changed how movies were greenlit. The divorce comedy became a massive genre, with films like The War of the Roses in 1989 serving as a dark, satirical cautionary tale. This movie, in particular, was a watershed moment. It didn't glamorize the split. It showed the literal destruction of the house and the couple. It was a visceral, violent reaction to the movement, suggesting that the Divorce Now path led to total mutual annihilation. Imagine if you were a child watching that film in 1989. You were seeing the subtext of your own life played out as a horror comedy. The media had gone from promoting the movement to mocking it, and finally to fearing it. This created a sense of national exhaustion. By the time 1989 turned into 1990, the Divorce Now movement hadn't stopped, but the celebration of it had. The high energy, "greed is good, happiness is a right" vibe of the 80s was being replaced by the somber, reflective tone of the early 90s. But what happened when this national exhaustion met the hidden data that the government had been suppressing for years? What was the Fatherless Generation report that leaked in late 1989, and how did it lead to a radical new set of laws that allowed the state to parent by proxy? And most importantly, what was the secret clause in the 1980s prenuptial agreements that was just now beginning to trigger, potentially wiping out the fortunes of the very people who thought they had one? In the next part, we are going to look at the legacy of the paperwork and the legal time bombs that were set in the 80s but are only exploding now in the year 2026. You might want to check your own parents' filing cabinets after this. The legacy of the paperwork is not a metaphor. It is a literal mountain of legal documentation that began to solidify in the year 1989. To understand why your own financial future might be tethered to a decades-old filing cabinet, you have to look at the transition from the handshake deals of the past to the ironclad, actuarial-driven contracts of the Divorce Now era. In the late 80s, lawyers began introducing specific clauses into settlement agreements that were designed to remain dormant for 30 or 40 years. These were the sunset provisions and the escalation clauses. They were written by young, ambitious attorneys in 1988, who are now the senior partners in the world's most powerful law firms. These documents were designed with the foresight that the wealth of the 1980s would eventually pass down to the next generation, and they wanted to ensure that a divorce from 1985 could still exert control over a trust fund in 2026. Imagine a man named Michael in 2026. Michael is 45 years old and is finally set to inherit his father's estate. His parents divorced in 1984, a classic case study of the Divorce Now movement. Back then, his mother's legal team insisted on a life insurance trust clause. This was a common but often overlooked detail in 80s settlements. It required the father to maintain a massive life insurance policy with the ex-wife as the irrevocable beneficiary, regardless of whether he remarried. Now, as Michael looks at the probate records, he realizes that a significant portion of what he thought was his inheritance is legally mandated to go to a woman his father hasn't spoken to in 40 years. This is the legal time bomb. The Divorce Now movement didn't just end the marriage. It created a permanent financial lien on the future. Historical trends show that the 1980s was the decade where the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, became the standard for splitting 401k and pension assets. However, many of the QDROs filed in 1987 were written with vague language regarding cost of living adjustments or survivor benefits. As the first wave of Divorce Now participants reaches their 80s and 90s in 2026, we are seeing a massive surge in litigation over these ancient documents. Case studies from this year show that elderly ex-spouses are suing for a share of pension increases that were never clearly defined in the original 1989 decree. The courts are being flooded with cases where the primary evidence is a yellowing piece of dot matrix printed paper from a defunct law firm. The movement created a legacy of ambiguity that is only now being resolved at the highest cost. Step by step, we have to look at the Hidden Data Report of 1989, which was a turning point for federal intervention. This report, commissioned in secret by a coalition of state governors, revealed that the Divorce Now movement was creating a systemic drain on the Social Security system. The data suggested that the fragmentation of families meant that fewer people were reaching retirement age with the shared assets necessary to support themselves. This led to the state becoming the parent by proxy. In 2026, we see the results of this in the form of filial responsibility, laws that some states are beginning to dust off. These laws, which haven't been widely enforced since the early 20th century, Allow the state to sue the adult children of divorced parents to pay for their indigent parents' long-term care. The Divorce Now movement broke the private safety net of the family, and the government is now forcing the children of those divorces to foot the bill. Consider the role of the 1980s real estate boom in this legal quagmire. In 1986, it was common for a divorcing couple to agree to a delayed sale of the family home. The agreement usually stated that the mother would stay in the house with the kids until the youngest turned 18, at which point the house would be sold and the proceeds split. However, many of these agreements were never updated as the property values in cities like Seattle, San Francisco, or Austin skyrocketed by thousands of %. Imagine the legal chaos in 2026 when a 70-year-old woman is forced to sell the home she has lived in for 40 years because of a clause her ex-husband's lawyer wrote in 1988. The movement prioritized the now, but it completely ignored the then. These houses have become the final battlegrounds of the Great Breakup. Furthermore, we must examine the secret clause in 80s prenuptial agreements known as the lifestyle maintenance provision. In the late 80s, as celebrity culture merged with the legal profession, wealthy individuals started including clauses that mandated a specific standard of living, even after the divorce. This included things like private jet hours, staffing requirements, and even specific geographic requirements for residents. In 2026, these clauses are being used by the grandchildren of the Divorce Now era to argue for massive trust fund distributions. They are claiming that because their parents' divorce decree from 1989 established a permanent lifestyle standard, the trustees must liquidate assets to maintain that standard in a much more expensive modern world. The 1980s didn't just create a culture of divorce, it created a culture of perpetual entitlement that is currently bankrupting multi-generational estates. The technological boom of the 80s also left behind a digital ghost. The early database records we discussed in Part 4, the ones used to track deadbeat parents, have evolved into the sophisticated credit scoring models of today. If you are struggling to get a mortgage in 2026, it might be because of a household stability score that uses historical data from your parents' 1980s litigation. Banks realize that children from high conflict, high litigation divorces statistically represent a different risk profile. The Divorce Now movement was the first time that family instability was quantified into a data point that could affect your financial life 40 years later. This is the ultimate legacy of the paperwork. Your parents' freedom in 1985 became your algorithmic constraint in 2026. As we look at the historical data, the year 1989 was also the moment the Fatherless Generation Report leaked. This was a document that warned of the long-term societal costs of the mass exit of men from the home. It predicted a rise in juvenile crime, a decline in graduation rates, and a massive increase in the need for psychological services. The government's response was to double down on the enforcement state, creating the supervised visitation and parental education mandates we see today. The movement had moved from a celebration of liberty to a desperate attempt at damage control. The 1980s closed with a sense that the revolution had succeeded, but the victors were standing in a field of debris. But what happened when the legal time bomb started hitting the healthcare industry? Why did a specific 1989 court ruling regarding frozen embryos become the foundation for the most controversial Supreme Court cases of the 2020s? And what was the DNA clause that lawyers began adding to divorce papers in late 1989 that would eventually lead to the destruction of the concept of legal fatherhood as we know it? In the next part, we are going to dive into the biotechnology of divorce and the moment the Divorce Now movement moved from the courtroom into the laboratory. You think a signature is permanent? Wait until you see what the 1980s did to your genetic rights. This is where the Great Breakup gets truly personal. The intersection of the Divorce Now movement and the dawn of modern biotechnology in the late 1980s created a legal and ethical frontier that no one was prepared to navigate. As the decade drew to a close, the battle for assets in children evolved into a battle for genetic material. This was the era where in vitro fertilization, or IVF, began to move from a scientific miracle to a domestic reality. However, because the Divorce Now movement had prioritized the right to exit, it created a massive legal vacuum regarding what happens to frozen embryos when the marriage dissolves. In 1989, the world watched as a Tennessee courtroom became the site of the Davis versus Davis case, the first of its kind. A couple who had undergone fertility treatments divorced, leaving 7 cryopreserved embryos in a laboratory. The husband wanted them destroyed to avoid becoming a father against his will. The wife wanted to use them or donate them. This case study is the foundation of our modern understanding of bodily autonomy within the context of divorce. In the late 80s, there were no statutes to guide the judge. The legal team for the husband argued that the Divorce Now movement's core principle was the right to be free from unwanted marital obligations. If he could be forced into fatherhood via an embryo, that freedom was an illusion. The wife's team argued that the embryos were a joint asset, a potential life that could not be liquidated like a stock portfolio. The 1980s was the moment the American legal system had to decide, are we people or are we property? The historical trends of 1989 show that this case forced every major fertility clinic in the United States to start including a mandatory disposition clause in their contracts. These are the same clauses that are causing massive legal upheavals in 2026. If you or your parents have frozen genetic material from that era, the signature on a 1989 medical form is currently overriding modern personal desires. The biotechnology of divorce also introduced the DNA clause into the standard divorce petition. Before the 1980s, the presumption of paternity was nearly absolute. If you were married to the mother, you were legally the father. But in the late 80s, the commercialization of DNA testing began to disrupt this centuries-old legal pillar. Imagine a man named Thomas in 1989. Thomas is going through a divorce now proceeding and his lawyer suggests a paternity test, not because there is evidence of infidelity, but as a tactical maneuver to avoid child support. This was a radical shift. The movement had turned the family into a set of verifiable data points. Historical trends from 1988 and 1989 show a significant rise in paternity challenges during divorce filings. This led to the destruction of the concept of legal fatherhood as a social bond, replacing it with a biological ledger. Step by step, the 1980s restructured how we think about the genetic future. By 1989, lawyers were advising high-net-worth clients to include clauses in their wills that specifically excluded any children born via reproductive technology after a divorce. This was the DNA protection clause. People were so terrified of the Divorce Now movement's ability to reach into their bank accounts that they were trying to legally disown potential children, who hadn't even been born yet. This created a new layer of psychological trauma for the children of the 80s, who grew up knowing that their very existence was often framed as a legal or financial liability in their parents' divorce decrees. In 2026, we are seeing the first wave of these children using consumer DNA databases to track down their biological parents and challenge those 1980s wills, leading to a massive redistribution of wealth that is currently paralyzing the probate courts. Imagine if it is 1989, and you are a doctor at a major metropolitan hospital. You are being subpoenaed not to testify about a physical injury, but to testify about a spouse's genetic predisposition to certain illnesses. In high-stakes Divorce Now cases, lawyers began using early genetic screening to argue that a spouse was a high-risk liability. If a wife could prove her husband was likely to develop a debilitating condition, she could argue for a higher upfront alimony settlement to ensure she was provided for before his earning potential dropped. This was the weaponization of the future. The movement had taught people to look at their partners not as lifelong companions, but as depreciating assets with biological expiration dates. The impact on the insurance industry was equally profound. In late 1989, insurance companies began experimenting with genetic risk adjustments for divorced individuals. The data suggested that the stress of the Divorce Now movement, combined with certain genetic markers, made these individuals a higher actuarial risk. While many of these practices were eventually restricted, the 1980s was the period where the intersection of your marital status and your DNA became a matter of public record. It was the end of domestic privacy. Everything from your bank statements to your blood cells was now property of the court. Consider the role of the 1989 Child Support Recovery Act in this context. As the government became more aggressive in its hunt for deadbeat parents, it began to authorize the use of state-mandated DNA testing for any child receiving public assistance. This was the moment the state took ownership of the genetic narrative of the poor. If a mother in 1989 needed help, she had to surrender the name of the father, and the state would use DNA to hunt him down. This created a two-tiered system of divorce. One for the wealthy, where DNA was used to protect assets, and one for the poor, where DNA was used to enforce labor. The Divorce Now movement had promised equality, but by 1989, it had delivered a high-tech version of the class struggle. The historical data from 1989 also points to the rise of the divorce insurance policy. Originally marketed to women who were worried about the economic fallout of the Great Breakup, these policies were based on complex algorithms that factored in everything from the couple's age to their genetic health. While these products never became mainstream, they represent the absolute peak of the 1980s mindset. That love is a risk, marriage is a contract, and divorce is a business transaction that requires a comprehensive hedging strategy. As we stand in 2026, we are living in the world that the 1980s laboratory built. The children of those frozen embryos are now adults fighting for their own reproductive rights. The fathers who were caught by the first DNA tests are now grandfathers dealing with the legal fallout of their biological history. The Divorce Now movement didn't just change the law, it changed the very fabric of human life. We no longer see ourselves as part of an unbreakable lineage. We see ourselves as a collection of individual traits that can be unbundled, litigated, and sold. But there is one final shocking secret about the 1980s Divorce Now movement that has been buried in the archives for nearly 40 years. It involves a secret group of lobbyists who weren't working for the lawyers or the feminists or the religious right. They were working for an industry you use every single day, and they were the ones who truly profited from the destruction of the American home. In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to expose the corporate architects of divorce and the specific plan they executed to ensure that you watching this in 2026 would never be able to afford a home of your own. You think divorce is a personal choice? You're about to find out it was a corporate mandate. The finale begins now. The corporate architecture of the Divorce Now movement was not built by accident. It was engineered by the most influential financial sectors in the United States between 1980 and 1989. To understand how this affects your ability to buy a home in 2026, we have to look at the hidden synergy between the banking industry, the consumer goods sector, and the lobbying groups that pushed for the total deregulation of the domestic contract. Historically, a married couple was an efficient, cost-saving unit. They shared one mortgage, one heating bill, and one set of appliances. From a corporate growth perspective, the nuclear family was a bottleneck. The 1980s heralded a shift toward the individual as the primary economic engine. If you can break one household into two, you effectively double the demand for credit, housing, and consumer durables. This is what economists call the domestic multiplier effect, and it was the secret fuel behind the 1980s economic boom. Imagine a couple named Mark and Jennifer in 1982. They live in a standard 3-bedroom home in a Chicago suburb. Their combined income supports one mortgage and one car payment. When the Divorce Now movement reaches their doorstep, they don't just split, they multiply. Jennifer moves into a condo, requiring a new mortgage and a new line of credit for furniture. Mark rents an apartment but eventually buys a smaller townhouse, necessitating another mortgage. Suddenly, the banking sector is collecting interest on 2 properties instead of 1. Historical trends from the mid-80s show that mortgage originations for single-person households spiked by nearly 40%. This was not a coincidence. Large-scale developers began lobbying for zoning changes that favored high-density, single-occupant housing over traditional family plots. They weren't just building homes. They were building the infrastructure for a nation of permanent individuals. Case studies of lobbying efforts in 1985 reveal that major credit card issuers were among the silent primary beneficiaries of the movement. Before the Divorce Now era, credit was often tied to the household. By 1987, the push for individual credit scores was in full swing. Financial institutions realized that divorced individuals were a higher-yield demographic. Because they were often forced to rebuild their lives from scratch, they carried higher balances and paid more in interest. The 1980s wasn't just the decade of the Great Breakup. It was the decade of the Great Indebtedness. The movement provided the perfect social cover for a massive expansion of the consumer credit market. If you are struggling with interest rates in 2026, you are navigating a system that was optimized 40 years ago to profit from the instability of the American home. Step by step, we see how this corporate mandate filtered down into the very way we view ownership. In 1988, the retail industry began to pivot its marketing. No longer were products sold to the family, they were sold to the achiever or the independent survivor. This psychological shift was designed to make the economic cost of divorce feel like an investment in personal brand. We saw the rise of the lifestyle brand during this period, which capitalized on the need for divorced individuals to project a new, successful identity. The Divorce Now movement effectively turned personal trauma into a market opportunity. By 1989, the cost of living was being calculated based on the assumption that most adults would be paying for their own housing and utilities individually, rather than sharing them. This is the primary reason why, in 2026, a single income is often insufficient to enter the housing market. The floor was raised by the corporate realization that they could charge 2 people for the life of one. Historical data from the 1980s also shows a significant correlation between the rise of the Divorce Now movement and the stagnation of real wages. As more women entered the workforce to support their independent households, the labor pool doubled. While this was a victory for gender equality, it also provided corporations with a surplus of labor that allowed them to keep wages from rising at the same rate as inflation. The economic reality of the late 80s was that it now required two incomes to achieve the same standard of living that one income provided in 1960. For the divorced person, this was a mathematical trap. They were working more for less relative buying power, while the costs of their individualized lives continued to climb. Furthermore, we must look at the role of the 1980s legal industry as a corporate lobby. Law firms became massive, multi-state enterprises during this decade, and they had a vested interest in ensuring that the Divorce Now movement remained a permanent fixture of American life. They lobbied against mediation and for adversarial litigation, because litigation was more profitable. They pushed for complex asset division laws that required more hours of billable work. By the time 1989 arrived, the divorce industry was estimated to be worth over $20 billion annually. This money didn't just stay in the pockets of lawyers. It was reinvested into political campaigns and social initiatives that ensured the cycle of dissolution would continue. Consider the real estate time bomb we mentioned earlier. In the late 80s, institutional investors began buying up distressed properties resulting from the Divorce Now fire sales. These investors realized that the fragmented family was a goldmine for the rental market. If people couldn't afford to buy two homes, they would be forced to rent. This was the beginning of the rent-seeker economy. By 1989, the percentage of American wealth held in residential real estate began to shift from the middle class to corporate entities. When you see a for rent sign on a house in 2026 that used to be a family home in 1984, you are seeing the final stage of a plan that was put into motion during the Divorce Now movement. Imagine if the United States public character named Alex is looking at his 2026 property tax bill. Alex is frustrated because his taxes have doubled, yet his community services have declined. This is another legacy of the 1980s. The Divorce Now movement led to the suburban sprawl of the late 80s, as developers rushed to create new neighborhoods for the newly single. This required a massive, inefficient expansion of infrastructure. More roads, more pipes, more police and fire coverage for a more spread-out population. The cost of maintaining this fragmented geography is what drives the tax rates of today. The 1980s movement didn't just break the home. It broke the municipal budget. The 1980s Divorce Now movement was the most successful economic restructuring in American history. It disguised a massive wealth transfer and a doubling of consumer demand as a social revolution for personal freedom. It taught us that our primary duty was to ourselves, while the corporate world quietly collected the divorce tax on every single aspect of our lives. As we look back from 2026, the data is undeniable. We are freer in our choices to leave, but we are more constrained in our ability to build something that lasts. The now in Divorce Now was always about the immediate gratification of the market, not the long-term health of the citizen. But as we conclude this masterclass, we have to ask, is the cycle finally breaking? In 2026, we are seeing a new movement, a reunion trend where the grandchildren of the 80s are rejecting the individualized model. They are forming intentional communities, multi-generational households, and new types of domestic contracts that protect against the corporate traps of the past. They are learning the lessons of 1989 so they don't have to repeat them. The great breakup of the 1980s was a necessary, painful transition that exposed the flaws in our old systems, but it also paved the way for a more conscious, protective way of building families. If you want to see the specific blueprints of these new 2026 domestic contracts and how they are literally bankrupting the old 1980s law firms, you need to see our next series. We are going to reveal the exit-proof marriage and the new digital tools that are taking the power away from the state and the corporations and putting it back into the hands of the couple. The 1980s changed the rules, but in 2026 we are finally changing the game. Turn on your notifications because the history of the future is being written right now.